1943, somewhere in the Pacific, northeast of the Solomons. They called him the Junkyard Scientist. He wasn't a commander or a hero or even supposed to fight. He fixed engines, that was all. But when his ship went down and 30 men were left to die on a nameless island, he built a weapon from wreckage, hope, and sheer defiance. A weapon the Navy never designed and the enemy never saw coming. Petty Officer Eli Rutherford was the kind of man who made machines talk. Back home in Oregon, he'd rebuilt motorcycle engines from scrap and welded irrigation pumps out of tractor parts. But on the destroyer escort, USS Marlin, his world was boilers, turbines, and a constant hum of diesel. The smell of hot oil was his comfort. Predictable, mechanical, controllable, war wasn't. On the morning the Marlin was hit, the sea was calm, deceptively calm. Japanese Betty bombers had vanished an hour before. The men joked. Then, from nowhere came the Torpedo, a single white wake that cut through the blue, slicing toward the hull like fate. The explosion split the ship's spine. Steam scalded through the engine room. Fire. Screaming water. Rutherford remembered dragging himself through a hatch, lungs filling with smoke, hands blistered on steel. When the world stopped shaking, he was floating. Debris all around, men shouting, clinging to life rafts. Somewhere behind him, the Marlin was sliding beneath the waves, engines still groaning like an animal dying by nightfall. The survivors had washed onto a speck of coral, an atoll too small to name. There were 32 of them, sunburned and half-mad from thirst. No shade, no radio signal, no food beyond a few emergency rations, just wreckage and a heat that peeled skin. The ranking officer, Lieutenant Graves, had taken a splinter through the chest. He lasted 2 days. After that, leadership dissolved into silence and salt water. Rutherford scavenged because that was all he knew how to do. He tore wiring from half-buried fuselage fragments, collected fuel drums that drifted in with the tide, and stripped a broken PBY Catalina of its spark plugs and magneto coil. The others laughed. "What are you doing, Eli? Building a damn coffee machine?" "Something like that," he muttered. By the 5th day, laughter died. A Japanese barge was spotted on the horizon. Grey, slow, deliberate. It wasn't a mirage. Through the heat shimmer they could see movement on deck. Binoculars confirmed it. Japanese landing craft, patrol-sized, coming straight toward them. The men froze. They had no radio, no working weapons. Just a few pistols and an empty Browning without a barrel jacket. That night, under the dying orange of the sunset, Rutherford sat staring at the debris scattered across the sand. His brain ticked like a motor winding down. Something clicked. He saw the shape of a solution in his mind, crude, insane, but possible. He dragged an empty 50-gallon drum across the beach, cut off the ends with a hacksaw, fitted a pipe through one side, then another. He stripped wiring from the Catalina cockpit and coiled it into a trigger system. His hands worked from memory, improvisation, and pure desperation. "What the hell are you building?" Corporal Larison asked. Rutherford didn't look up. "A torpedo," he said flatly. They laughed again, not with amusement this time, but disbelief. "You're out of your mind." "Probably," Rutherford said, "but it's the only thing I'm good at." He built through the night. Sweat and salt stung his eyes. The air reeked of fuel and rust. He scavenged propeller blades from the Catalina wreckage to shape fins, bolted them with stripped screws, sealed cracks with melted wax from signal flares. By dawn, a rough shape lay in the sand, a 9-foot cylinder patched with tin, welded seams glinting under the sun. Inside, a compressed air tank sat beside a crude fuel line rigged with scavenged valves. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. Rutherford crouched beside it like a priest before an altar. Larison watched from a few feet away. "You really think this'll work?" Rutherford smirked faintly. "Doesn't have to work. Just has to scare them off long enough for us to breathe. The men called him mad, but by noon even the doubters were hauling scrap for him. Fear had a way of turning mockery into faith. That evening the Japanese barge edged closer, distant but inevitable. Through the shimmering air its silhouette grew sharper. Soon they'd be in range of its deck guns. Rutherford wiped sweat from his brow, staring at his creation. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we see if this heap can bite." The others sat in the dark, silent except for the hiss of waves. No one slept. By dawn, the island looked like a scrapyard reborn. Every surface shimmered with metal, aluminum wings, copper wiring, corroded pipes. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and desperation. Rutherford stood over his makeshift torpedo, shoulders burnt red, eyes bloodshot. His fingers trembled not from fatigue but from focus. The men had begun calling the contraption Eli's folly. They still helped him, because doing something was better than waiting for death, but few believed it could work. A torpedo, made from garbage. They'd seen engines fail under ideal conditions. This was insanity baked under a Pacific sun. Rutherford ignored them. He'd been an engine man too long to let ridicule stop him. He'd seen men misjudge machines 1,000 times. The difference between failure and miracle was often a single turn of a wrench. He crouched beside the cylinder, using the heel of his hand to trace a rough diagram in the sand. Arrows, pressure lines, exhaust ports. "Air intake here," he muttered. "Fuel mixed through the pipe. Pressure pushes it out the tail. And if the spark catches, it'll run until it explodes or drowns." "Or kills us," muttered Larison. "Or kills us," Rutherford repeated dryly. "But if we're already dead men, might as well go loud." He scrounged through the pile of parts. The magneto coil from the PBY, a fuel gauge from the wrecked lifeboat, bits of radio wire, and a propeller blade shaved down into fins. Every piece was something the ocean had given back. When he connected the magneto to a crude crank handle, the others gathered around. He turned it, slowly, carefully, and the coil snapped to life with a weak spark. The men gasped. For a brief second, the impossible seemed real. Rutherford smiled. "That's ignition, boys. Now we just need propulsion." He built a small compressed air chamber using a scavenged oxygen tank from a drowned diver's kit. The system wasn't elegant, more like a glorified air rifle, but it could drive the propeller shaft for a few seconds before the main charge took over. The main charge was the real danger, a cluster of scavenged depth charge explosives, disarmed and rewired by hand. Rutherford had no training in ordnance. He simply relied on instinct, diagrams he'd seen once in manuals, and the dull hum of mechanical sense that had never failed him. By midday, the men's skepticism had turned to uneasy silence. They were beginning to believe, or at least to hope. The Japanese barge was now clearly visible with binoculars, squat, grey, bristling with deck guns, moving slowly between the reefs. They had maybe a day. Rutherford gathered his team under the shade of a single driftwood tarp. "We'll launch it from the lagoon's mouth," he said, drawing another crude map in the sand. "Tide will pull it outward, and if my math's right, it'll hit them on the port side." Larison frowned. "If your math's right?" Rutherford looked up. "Math's usually right. People aren't." That night, while others slept or pretended to, he worked. Every clang of metal echoed through the still air. He adjusted the propeller shaft with a wrench scavenged from a toolbox that had floated ashore. He filed down rust with coral fragments. He even carved a makeshift guidance fin out of a broken oar. His hands were blistered, bleeding, but alive. The stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, the war raged. Battleships firing at unseen enemies, cities burning. But on that forgotten speck of land, One man was fighting a quieter war, against despair, against logic, against the universe itself. By dawn, the Torpedo lay ready, a monstrous patchwork of pipes, drums, and dreams. Rutherford sat beside it, staring at the waves. "You ever name a machine?" he asked Larison. "Only the ones that try to kill me," the corporal said. "Then this one's definitely getting a name." Rutherford smiled faintly. "Let's call her Marlin's Revenge." They rolled the contraption to the edge of the lagoon using driftwood poles as rollers. It took 6 men to move it, and every groan of metal sounded like a prayer. They set it on a makeshift cradle made from coral and rope. Rutherford adjusted the firing mechanism, a crude percussion cap connected to the magneto-spark, triggered by a pull cord. The wiring was wrapped in strips of canvas, sealed with wax and covered in sand to keep it cool under the sun. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She's ready." Larison stared at the metal beast, its fins glinting under the rising sun. "Eli, you sure about this?" "No," Rutherford said, "but we're out of choices." The men gathered behind him, 30 sailors reduced to ghosts, faces drawn tight, eyes hollow. They watched as Rutherford knelt beside his machine and closed his eyes for a brief second. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's see if you can swim." He yanked the cord. The spark ignited. The drum rattled like a living thing. The air filled with a hiss, then a deafening roar. Sand sprayed upward as the Torpedo lurched forward, belching flame and smoke, carving a white scar across the lagoon. It worked. For a few glorious seconds, it worked. Then, halfway across the lagoon, the sound faltered. The propeller stuttered. The cylinder slowed, sputtered, and stopped. The machine bobbed uselessly on the waves. A sick silence fell over the beach. The men stared, numb. Larison kicked at the sand. All that for nothing. Rutherford didn't move. He just kept staring at the floating failure, his jaw tight. "Not nothing," he said quietly. "Now I know what broke." He turned and began walking back toward the pile of wreckage. "Where are you going?" someone shouted. "Back to work," Rutherford said. The men exchanged glances. The Japanese barge was still approaching, its black silhouette like a slow blade on the horizon. They were running out of time. But the Junkyard Scientist wasn't done yet. The sun rose like molten brass over the Pacific. The Japanese barge was less than 6 miles out now, close enough that the crew could see sunlight flash off its gun barrels. The men on the atoll had begun counting hours, not days. And yet, in the middle of that hopeless countdown, Eli Rutherford was still knee-deep in salt water, hammering on scrap metal. Failure hadn't broken him. It had focused him. He disassembled the failed Torpedo piece by piece, laying each component on a tarp made from parachute fabric. Every fragment told him something: a wrong angle, a warped seal, a leak in the intake valve. His fingers traced each surface like a surgeon reading a wound. "The ignition worked," he murmured. "Pressure built too fast. We need a bleed valve." He scavenged the missing parts from the wreck of a Japanese floatplane that had crashed on the far side of the atoll months earlier. It had been there long before they arrived, twisted metal, shark-bitten corpses long gone from its engine housing. Rutherford salvaged copper tubing, a pressure regulator, and one intact fuel cell. By the time he returned, his arms were bleeding from coral cuts. But his eyes, they burned. Not with exhaustion, but purpose. "Eli," Larison said quietly, "the barge'll be here by sunset. You can't build miracles in a day." Rutherford looked up from the workbench. "Watch me." He welded with sunlight, literally. Using a broken signal mirror, he concentrated rays onto magnesium shavings to fuse seams. He coiled wiring through the air valve system, sealing each joint with melted rubber. Sweat ran down his face in rivers, but he didn't stop. The men watched in silence. Somewhere between madness and genius, their machinist had become something else. A man possessed by pure defiance. By afternoon, the new version of Marlin's Revenge was ready. Shorter, sleeker, balanced with weights from shell casings and lead fragments. The guidance fins were recalibrated, bent by hand and tested in tide pools. The ignition was now double spark, wired through 2 separate coils to prevent misfire. When he turned the magneto crank, the spark snapped louder than before, strong, angry. "All right, sweetheart," Rutherford whispered. "Let's give them something to remember." They loaded the torpedo again, dragging it to the edge of the lagoon. The air smelled of ozone and salt. The Japanese barge was less than 3 miles away now, its engine rumble audible over the surf. The men crouched behind coral ridges, clutching their few remaining rifles. Rutherford crouched behind his contraption, one hand on the pull cord, one on the cradle release. Larison crouched beside him, staring at the weapon like it was a prayer wrapped in steel. "If this goes wrong," Larison said, "we'll be a bonfire." Rutherford grinned through cracked lips. "Then we'll burn bright." He yanked the cord. The magneto screamed to life. Crack! And a surge of compressed air kicked the propeller into motion. The torpedo leapt from the cradle like it had been waiting for this moment since birth. Water fountained behind it as it tore across the lagoon, trailing a wake of bubbles and fire. Every man on the island rose to his feet, hearts pounding. The weapon streaked through the surf, slicing between coral heads and whitecaps. It didn't slow this time. It didn't sputter. It moved with terrifying purpose. "Holy hell," someone whispered. "It's working." Through binoculars they saw it, a white streak cutting toward the dark hull of the barge. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then came the impact. A blinding flash erupted against the barge's port side. The sound arrived half a second later, a deep, chest-rattling boom that echoed across the lagoon. A fireball climbed into the sky, swallowing the silhouette of the ship. The blast was too powerful for a single makeshift warhead. It must have ignited the barge's own fuel stores. The men on the atoll screamed, part disbelief, part triumph. Larison dropped to his knees, laughing hysterically. "He did it! Son of a bitch actually did it!" Rutherford didn't cheer. He just stared at the burning wreck, expression unreadable. "It worked," he said quietly. "Now maybe someone will believe us." The barge burned for hours. Smoke rolled across the sea in thick black columns. As darkness fell, small explosions rippled through the wreck, lighting the horizon like fireworks. The men sat in silence, the weight of what they'd just witnessed slowly sinking in. That night, the sky glowed faintly from the fire still burning miles away. The men built a signal bonfire with what fuel they had left, hoping American planes might spot it. Rutherford sat apart from the others, staring out at the sea. Larison approached. "You know," he said, "when this gets out, they're gonna call you a hero." Rutherford shook his head. "They'll call me lucky." "Same thing." He smiled faintly. "Not in the Navy, it isn't." Silence hung between them. The surf hissed against coral, washing away traces of the day's insanity. Rutherford leaned back against the sand. "You realize that wasn't supposed to happen," he said. "No machine that broken should have worked. No pressure system that unstable should have held." Larison chuckled. "So, what was it then?" Rutherford looked at his hands, blistered, blackened, trembling. "It was rage," he said simply. "Rage turned into mathematics." For the first time in days, the island felt alive again. Men laughed, some cried. For a moment, the war was far away. They had turned junk into vengeance, and vengeance had answered. The next morning, distant engines echoed across the water. "Aircraft!" someone shouted. Rutherford shielded his eyes. Far above, 2 silhouettes cut through the clouds, American Catalina patrol planes. They'd seen the smoke. The men waved shirts, flags, anything that moved. The planes banked once, circled, then dropped supply canisters by parachute. Food, water, flares, life. When the first crate hit the sand, the men erupted in cheers. But Rutherford didn't move. He was staring at the remains of his makeshift torpedo cradle. The tide had swallowed it. All that remained were twisted fragments of pipe and wire. Larison walked up beside him. "You look like a man who just lost something." Rutherford nodded slowly. "I did. Lost the proof." "Proof?" "That it worked," he said. "They'll never believe it when we tell them." "Then we'll tell it anyway." Rutherford exhaled. The war would move on. Ships would be built, battles fought, medals handed out. But the story of a machinist who turned wreckage into a weapon that would vanish into rumor unless someone wrote it down. He looked toward the horizon, where smoke still marked the grave of the Japanese barge. "Maybe some things are better left unbelievable," he said softly. 3 days later, the USS Halsey appeared on the horizon, a grey ghost sliding through the surf. Its deck guns glinted in the sun as landing boats splashed into the lagoon. The survivors of the Marlin staggered to their feet, waving frantically. For most, it was salvation. For Eli Rutherford, it was the end of an experiment no one was meant to see. The Navy doctors hauled them aboard, one by one, dehydrated, half-delirious, salt-burned. Rutherford resisted at first, refusing to leave the atoll until the last of his men was lifted off. When he finally climbed the rope ladder, he looked back at the island. Nothing left but driftwood, debris, and a few rusted fragments glinting like bones in the sand. He felt hollow. The noise of the Halsey's engines was comforting, but something inside him remained stuck on that beach, where he had welded miracles out of garbage and fear. In the ship's infirmary, Commander Wilkes questioned him for hours. "How did you make it? What weapon did you use? What kind of charge?" Rutherford tried to explain about the pipes, the fuel drums, the magnetospark, the timing valve. But the officers just stared. Their disbelief was thicker than respect. "So you're saying," Wilkes said slowly, "you built a torpedo out of scrap metal, alone, without tools, and it destroyed a fully armed Japanese landing barge?" Rutherford met his eyes. "That's exactly what I'm saying, sir." The commander closed his notebook. "You understand how that sounds?" "Yeah," Rutherford said, "like a miracle that makes engineers look bad." No one laughed. Still, orders came down to document everything. Navy intelligence officers combed the atoll a week later, photographing the remains of his contraption, sketching what little was left of the firing system. Their notes called it improvised explosive delivery apparatus, unverified functionality. Bureaucratic words for a weapon they couldn't believe existed. When Rutherford was sent home months later, the story followed him, distorted, doubted, retold. Some said he'd found a working torpedo and fired it by accident. Others claimed the Japanese barge had blown up from its own ammunition. In naval archives, the incident was filed under unconfirmed enemy loss, coordinates redacted. But among the 30 men he'd saved, there was no debate. They'd seen the flames, they'd felt the blast, they'd lived. Years passed. The war ended. The Pacific quieted. Rutherford returned to Oregon, back to the hum of engines and the hiss of acetylene torches. He opened a small workshop behind his house, repairing farm machinery, boat engines, anything that moved. He rarely spoke of the war. But on certain nights, when the wind carried the smell of salt and oil, he'd sit behind his workbench, running his fingers over a dented brass valve, the only piece of his torpedo he'd been able to keep. It was warped, blackened, barely recognizable, but to him it was proof that a man with nothing but his hands and imagination could fight a war his own way. In 1952, a Navy engineer named Lieutenant Arthur Mendez tracked him down. Mendez had been studying field improvisations, the strange, desperate inventions soldiers built under fire. He brought with him a folder of faded photographs, grainy images of Rutherford's torpedo fragments, the exploded barge, and eyewitness reports. "I've been chasing your ghost for years," Mendez said. "They call you the Junkyard Scientist." Rutherford chuckled, wiping grease from his palms. "Still not sure that's a compliment." "It should be," Mendez replied. "That design of yours, the pressure system, the combustion mix, it's been circulating in the Navy's emergency innovation files. They're using it as a case study." "For what?" Rutherford asked. "For what happens when necessity ignores the manual." The two men talked for hours. Mendez showed him sketches inspired by Rutherford's work, prototypes of emergency launch torpedoes designed for stranded crews. Crude, simple, effective. On one diagram, Rutherford recognized his own idea, the air chamber layout, the dual spark ignition, even the shape of the fins. "You took my scrap heap and made it pretty," he said. Mendez smiled. "You gave us the idea, the rest was just polish." When Mendez left, Rutherford stood in the doorway of his shop, staring at the photos one last time. He wasn't sure if he felt proud or hollow. The Navy had taken his madness and turned it into a blueprint. But for him, the real victory wasn't the weapon. It was that moment on the atoll when 30 starving men looked at him not as a mechanic, but as their last hope. Decades later, after his death, historians pieced together his file from the Navy's Emergency Innovation Archives. Among diagrams of field radios and makeshift flamethrowers was a single note scrawled in faded ink. "Improvised torpedo weapon, effective against enemy barge. Built from salvaged aircraft and shipwreck materials. Concept validated. Creator: Machinist's Mate First Class, Eli Rutherford. The Junkyard Scientist." The file included no photographs of his face, no commendations, no medals, just those words. Somewhere in a warehouse, the fragment of his torpedo still lies beneath dust and fluorescent light, a relic of stubborn genius forged on a nameless island. Tourists and researchers might walk past it someday, mistaking it for scrap metal. But once, in the middle of the Pacific, that scrap saved 30 lives. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it still, the echo of a man hammering on steel, daring the impossible to work one more time.